Signore e signori, buonasera. Benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò della New York University for the premiere of the documentary Before Neorealism, directed by David Lee Morea and produced by Alberto Zambenedetti. We are particularly proud and honored and happy to present this premiere because both David and Alberto are somehow a product of NYU Department of Italian Studies. And one more reason to be proud of this project that finally sees the light of day in its final form is the fact that I believe, and David and Alberto might correct me if I'm wrong, that the seminal idea of this project was born during a visit to Cinecittà that we did during the Summer in Florence program about 10 years ago. And it was, I went many times with students, but that was the only time when we had a chance to get inside the De Angelis storage space that is sort of a trip inside the history of world cinema. Because, of course, there are props and costumes and objects that you recognize from films from all over the world. So I believe that somehow the idea of realizing this documentary, and David also wrote his master thesis about this topic, was born probably during this trip to Cinecittà. I don't want to speak more also because for some fortuitous reasons, and not very fortunate for you, I've been told that I appear in a disproportionate manner in the documentary. So you're going to see enough of me in there. But at the end of the screening, we'll have a chance to ask questions to David and Alberto. And I would like to thank also my colleague, Ruth Benguiat, who is here with us for the screening. She also appears in the documentary, not in the way in which she should appear, because she's really the authority about Italian cinema and fascist cinema in particular. So I'm particularly grateful to Ruth for being here. She was also Alberto's advisor, and David also worked with her. So thank you, Ruth, for following your former students up to the very success of this evening. Thank you all again very much, and I'll see you at the end of the screening. The film lasts about an hour. Thank you. I would like to invite to the stage the producer of the film, Alberto Zambenedetti, and the director, David Lee Morea. Bravo. So before we proceed with our Q&A, I have two announcements. The first one is that you saw that in David's film, the Zika plays a prominent role. And as luck would have it, in New York right now, there is a series dedicated to the Zika, both as actor and as director. And whereas I'm pretty sure that you're all familiar with most of the Zika's film as director, very few in the US have had a chance to see his films as actor, and many of the clips here are from his acting past, and he was a fantastic actor. So it's at Film Forum for one more week, so until October 8th. So it's a few blocks from here. Check out the program and make sure you see some of the films that David presented in clips in their entirety. One more thing for all film lovers. Next week on Friday and Thursday and Friday, October 8th and 9th, we're going to have an international conference on cinema and Italian identity. And there are flyers for you on the way out. And it's an outstanding group of film scholars that is coming. And we are closing the works of this 2 days conference with the screening of Il Giovane Favoloso, the new film by Mario Martone dedicated to the great 19th century Italian poet Giacomo Leopardi. So these are the announcements. And now, since I've spoken enough during the film, I really would like you to have questions for our friends. Yes?
In the pre-credit montage before the title of the film comes on, there's a bunch of very short selection of films. I'm sure one of them has Magnani in a chorus line. She was a nightclub singer previously, and
That was from Teresa Venedi, and she plays the role of a famous actress in it, and she's kind of jaded and a nasty woman, and as you could see it, I think it's one of the later clips. She kind of does that like dance where she's like, "All right, let's just get through with this."
I would love to see some of her early movies.
And interestingly enough, that was actually what Magnani did. She was a vaudeville actress, cabaret actress, that really made her beginnings in the very rough Roman theaters. The idea was that before screening films, they would have a vaudeville like they would have here. And they would have dancers and maybe a stand-up comedian. And Magnani had a very, very tough role because normally from girls they expected long legs and pretty faces, and Magnani had none of that going for her. So she had to really carve for herself a role and being accepted for being the fantastic actress that she was, and also a comedian with a mean sense of humor of her own beyond the title. So it's interesting that in Teresa Venerdì she's casted almost as what she really was before becoming a film star.
It's a little bit more rigid.
All of Rossellini's so-called fascist war films, and you certainly can't take any blatant propaganda from those films. But as he became sort of the representative of the Neorealist movement, the leftist movement after the war, I understand he often tried to suppress in his biographies the fact that he actually made these films before the war. Did he go out of his way to suppress the fact that
I wouldn't know exactly what happened on his personal level. What happened? I know a lot of them just made like a huge effort as to moving forward, as opposed and changing their ideology towards fascism and the now new Italy. I believe there is a few texts out there where they kind of like De Sica and Rossellini describe their personal journeys. I haven't gotten my hands on it. I don't know if you have.
I think that the issue with Rossellini definitely had this very ingombrante fascist past, and everybody knew what he did. It was not a secret. These films were in theaters. It was very well known that he did these films. Unlike Vecchia Guardia, that was definitely a film of fascist propaganda, celebrating, for example, one of the squads of the milizia going for an expedition to beat up doctors and nurses on strike. So that's part of the Vecchia Guardia, Blasetti. Rossellini's films were never quite so blatant in their propaganda effort, but they were definitely part of the propaganda machine, especially war propaganda machine of fascism. What I have to say in favor of Rossellini is that at any given time in his career, he was totally concentrating in what he was doing at that time. So, for example, in the 60s and 70s, as you know, he did a lot of films for television with a very strong educational motivation. So he did the series on Descartes, on St. Augustine, on Louis XIV, on Cosimo de' Medici. They're not great films compared to his masterpieces of neorealism. But there are films in which he invested all of himself with the strong belief that through cinema you can educate people. And in the specific case of the historical films he's made, you can educate people about their own history, and by teaching them their history, you teach them their present. I know as a fact that when he was called to an American university to speak, and that happened quite often, they would always want to show Open City and the other films of the war trilogy, and said, enough, I don't want to see Open City anymore. I'm doing other things, that's what I want to talk about. So definitely the Uomo della Croce and so on represented some sort of problem that he had. But on the other hand, he was really a man that was constantly absorbed in the present and in whatever he was doing at that time. So much so that he really died in poverty. Basically, he kept selling the rights or the money that he obtained from the previous film to produce the new one out of his own pocket. And he had nothing left. So whatever you think of Rossellini, I think you have to give him credit for being so committed to the present of his work as a filmmaker, whatever it was. And despite the hierarchies that we as film scholars might have.
I think the problem with Rossellini is that there's not really a problem, but the issue is he has a history of changing his ideology from one to another, and I think in the case of fascism versus neorealism, it's just a situation of the opportunism that they were presented, where they didn't really have much of a choice they were a little bit more constricted on what to make during the regime cinema, and then once it was all relieved, they were able to make these films with a little bit more auteurness to it, and they were kind of a little bit more in-depth and...
Well, I mean, just to address your question very quickly, sort of like what, and to kind of dovetail on what Stefano was saying, is that, you know, at the heart of sort of like what you see in Rossellini's cinema, you see it evolving in ideological terms, but he was and always was and remained throughout this career a deep humanist. Like, what was at the center of his investigation was mankind, and in whatever circumstances, you know, that then was forced to appear, you know. So during fascism, he was a filmmaker working within the cogs of the fascist film industry. But no, I'm just, you know, kind of like finessing a little bit what we're trying to say with the documentary, I guess, or addressing it. And what you see there, as you know, Stefania Parigi says, is like that there's already a very strong interest in people. And that is not necessarily the case in all of the fascist films. A lot of them kind of like flatten the individual because it has to serve the ideology, whereas Rossellini worked within that ideology, but kept mankind very sharply in focus throughout his career. And, you know, which is very close to what Stefano was saying, but it is undeniable that there have been ideological shifts throughout his career that reflected the ideological shifts that Italy went through. And in a way, if you want to make the case that, you know, if you were a filmmaker in the late 1930s or early 1940s and you wanted to work, it was very, very difficult to work outside of that machinery. The only one really that's an outlier, you know, is Visconti.
Thank you, Alberto. Yes?
We had 2 days ago at Columbia, Marcel Wolfwoods talking to us about making good documentaries. And I just want to say yours is absolutely first class.
Thank you. I like that. It's very kind of you.
If you look at early Italian silent film and Hollywood silent film set in the Roman period, from Cabiria to the middle, his biblical Roman epics, Fred Niblow's Ben-Hur, and if you study the iconography, the parades, the uniforms, the style, the production design, if you will, it seems to me that the Germans were studying this period very carefully. And I've never heard anyone talk about the similarity between the two. If you look at Triumph of the Will and Nuremberg, and you look at Ben-Hur side by side, it seems to me it was the same designer. And if the Germans were saying, I like this Roman look, I want the German look to be the same. Do you see the parallel between the two? Have you ever thought about this?
It depends on how we're looking at it. We describe a lot in the film that there was a lot of influence of Germany, or Italy had a huge influence on this silent era before Germany did, and then it kind of goes back and forth until Italy's system kind of crashes, and then they kind of, as we mentioned in the film, they start doing the documentaries, which is what greatly influenced Hitler. So there is a lot of parallels to how it works, and you can easily see that there's a lot of influence from the Italian side to the German side.
This is
Fun.
dead.
We can hear you.
You can hear us? Okay.
No, I just laughed.
First of all, thank you for what you said. Never in my life I would have thought, that anything I was affiliated with, associated with me, compared to a fool's. That's beyond, that's beyond incredible that you would say that. The one thing is, obviously the famous story that David, Griffith would go see Cabiria and would drive 5 hours to San Francisco to see Cabiria, and then Intolerance would be based on that, on the looks of Cabiria. It would go back to Hollywood and say, I want my film to look like that. So obviously, there's a very fertile collaboration at that point, which is facilitated, of course, by the fact that the film was silent. You had to swap the intertitles and you were done. But you pointed out something about the look of Italian silent epics and Germany that I was not really thinking about. So it's very helpful for me.
Thank you. Yes.
The film briefly touched on issues of portrayal of race, primarily with reference to the Harlem film. But this was also a period in which Italy had embarked on a colonial war against Ethiopia. To what extent was race and its treatment in film subject to guidance from the regime? Did it have talking points, how it wanted that portrayed? Did it in fact portray the people who were being conquered in Africa as savage or subordinate, or as grateful partners with Italy in building a shared culture? How did they handle race, not only in the U.S., how they portrayed it, but also in the domains where they were hoping to expand? And did they take cues in the last 5 years of the 30s from race as it was being elevated in their German allies' film and propaganda?
It's a great question, and too bad that the world expert on this just left 5 minutes ago, and she was sitting there, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who wrote a great book just published last spring called Fascism, Empire, Cinema, in which, among many other things, she addresses specifically the issue of the representation of race in the films produced by fascism at the time of the occupation of Northern Africa. The answer is not one. It's the different races are represented in different ways. It's not always that they're presented as savage and uncivilized. It's much more nuanced than that. And from what I gather from Ruth's research is that there is really a plurality of representations within the same race. So there are different kinds of Africans. There were the ones that are the Ascari, that are the ally of the Italians, represented in a completely different way, by the way they walk, by the way they dress, by the way they speak. So there are different. There is a hierarchy within each race. So it's much more complicated than that we would normally expect. But David, if you want to.
Yeah, and I think that it's kind of, as I would have in the film, separated it into different genres. There's the comedies, which kind of explores people, not necessarily different races, but people who just aren't Italian, as basically kind of lessers. They're the ones who cower under pressure. They're the ones who shoot you, and they're the ones who have this. They're the greedy ones, or the thieves. And then the Italian ones are the sophisticated working people who play sports and are trying to speak foreign languages and move up socially. Whereas, as I'm not an expert on the colonial side, I would have considered that of the African conquest, the colonial films. And there are a few films where I believe they do. In my opinion, kind of see it as a race to be conquered and a race to kind of be domesticated. And I'll let Alberto extend on that.
Well, just what Stefano was saying is that there's a whole array of different representations, and it's not really, you kind of like offer like a binary choice here, and I would say it's those and more. There is a degree to which it's part of the colonial project. You want to assimilate them, but that depends on their social status. That depends on their skin tone to some extent. The project itself, was not necessarily always cohesive and coherent, as you probably know. Their relationship with education and what are we going to do? Are we going to open Italian schools and we're going to teach the language or not? And that kind of ambiguity and overall racism transfers into the movies in the 1950s. In 1948, we have Macario putting on blackface and, then washing it off. There are a number of problems with the representation of race that are grounded in the years that you were talking about, and even before, and they transfer into the post-war cinema. But like I said, right, Ruth would be she is the world expert on that kind of thing. So I would point you to that volume as to find the whole array of answers.
Ma'am, yes. Can you speak up, please? Yes, the lady saw a couple of years ago a neorealist film called Giorni di Gloria, and she wanted to know something about that film.
Yeah. So in the documentary, we talk about Ossessione as one of the first films by Visconti. Visconti made, Ossessione in 1943, and he was part of the team of people who made Giorni di Gloria in 1945, which is a film about what happens in immediate days behind the liberation, and it's a documentary. And it's sort of like a compilation of things that are woven together very organically. And they speak about the Fosse Ardeatine massacre. They speak about the lynching of one of the fascist collaborators just before his trial, and then they speak about the trial to the chief of police, the Roman chief of police, and the consequent execution of the chief of police, which looks identical to the one that you're going to see at the end of Rome Open City, where the Don Morosini figure, is killed. We didn't specifically talk about that film because that is one of those that really breaks away with the type of continuity that we want to point attention to, because the thrust of the documentary comes from this idea that we think it is problematic when you just portray neorealism as this big moment of rupture, and that's kind of like unproblematically portrayed as that. And that has brought many institutions to teach Italian film or to put Italian film in their curriculum and just start from 1945 as if it never existed before. And when I was at the University of Toronto, for instance, the first thing that I did was just to start, we started in 1905. We start from the first, few reels. We start, and you have to kind of, if you're going to tell that story, you got to tell it from the beginning. And what you realize the more you look at the stuff of cinema is that there were significant, aesthetic continuities, if not political, but there were some aesthetic, continuities. And Giorni di Gloria is not here because Giorni di Gloria is one of those films that was in strong opposition. It was a film made by a group of communist guys who were, card-carrying communists and never, for once entertained the idea of being fascists.
I also didn't want to go too far into neorealism, if at all. So, we had to mention a little bit, but.
That is correct.
Yes. No. Visconti is actually one of the few directors immune by the contamination with fascism, also because he spent time in France, and that's where he came in contact with people like Jean Renoir, and that's also when he had his first exposure to Marxist ideology, and as you know, he became a card-carrying member of the Italian Communist Party. And at the same time is that the social status of Lucchino, Visconti, Count of Modrone, Duke of this and that, sort of sheltered him from the pressures that people that did not come from that social status would have. But he was in France in the most heated moments when fascism was really triumphant. And that's where he had his apprenticeship as a director. That's basically where he learned the trade. So he's definitely a great Italian director, and we want to claim him all for ourselves. But it's hard not to see in Lucchino Visconti the French influence of the great masters with whom he worked. But no, he was not in any way connected with fascist cinema. He basically made Ossessione in 1943. He somehow negotiates his own room, but there is nothing fascist about Ossessione.
No, it's the idea of, I mean, Ossessione is interesting because if you read the screenplay, it would look just one of those family dramas that were being made in 43, and then when you see the movie, you realize that he's taking down the system, essentially. I mean, Visconti spent some time in a fascist jail, so there's, you know, you cannot call him a fascist at all.
Yeah? Yes, please.
I fell in love with
Anna Magnani.
when I first saw the rose tattoo, and I liked her tough vulnerability. Was that film made in Italy, or was it in the United States?
A Rose Tattooed?
Yeah.
Here in Hollywood. Yeah. Tennessee Williams met Anna in Rome.
How far along was that after the war?
54, so it's about 10 years after the war. And originally she was intended to act in the play on Broadway. And she really studied English very hard because she hoped she could do it. But she was an incredibly brilliant woman on top of being a fantastic actress. And she decided that she couldn't do theater in English, no matter how hard she studied. But she accepted to do a cinematographic version of it. And yeah, and Tennessee Williams was in love with her. And who wouldn't be?
Yes, I'd like to know if in the early years of fascism, film industry, were any Jewish people involved? And that's my first question. The second question is, Fellini old enough to be, young enough, or old enough to be in film in the fascist theater?
I do believe Fellini was a PA during, like a PA, I would translate as a PA, during Neorealism. Screenwriter. And he, but as far as the Jews in fascist cinema, I'm not sure about that.
No. He moved to Rome during the years of fascism.
1939.
Yeah,
If I'm not mistaken, you arrived to Rome in 1939. He was 19 years old when he got there. And he began writing as a journalist, and, you know, and he was a vignettist too, and a cartoonist. And Aldo Fabrizi introduced him to Roberto Rossellini, and that's how he starts writing. He ends up writing the screenplay, or is one of the co-writers of the screenplay for Rome Open City. But Aldo Fabrizi really, really liked Fellini, and so he was the first one to give him his first film gigs, let's say. And if you notice that in many, not all of them, but many of the Neorealist films, you have 4 or 5 screenwriters, and that's a technique, you know, of screenwriting that, you know, they had learned at the Centro Sperimentale per la Cinematografia, where, you know, the process of writing was, you know, not too dissimilar for like a writer's room would look like today, when you have, you know, 5 people together and you throw ideas around and you bounce them off each other and you end up with a screenplay. So it's not that uncommon that you have this sort of like interesting tonal, you know, differences throughout the film, and that's, you know, why in Rome Open City you have a few jokes that are interesting. We have one in the film when Aldo Fabrizi kind of like turns the statue around. He doesn't let the 2 statues kind of like look at each other because one is disrobed, and that's famously one of the jokes that have been attributed to Fellini's input, because he had, you know, he was quick, it was witty, and he was quick at throwing jokes in there. So he would have been involved somehow in the years of the transition, but he didn't make his first film until 1950, which he co-directed.
And he was assistant director to Rossellini in Paisa.
That's correct.
Yeah. So it was the first time that he had a job on a set was with Rossellini. Rossellini was not very happy when Fabrizi imposed Fellini basically to write his lines for Open City, as any director would not be happy if an actor comes in and says, oh, and that guy there that you never heard of before is going to write my line for your film. But Fabrizi was imposed by somebody who gave the money to Rossellini he needed to do Open City, so he accepted Fabrizi, and the fact that Fabrizi came with his own personal screenwriter, the young and unknown Roberto Rossellini.
Thank God.
He was also a comic.
He was a caricaturist. He had a shop. Oh no, Fabrizi was a comic. He was, again, vaudeville, avant spettacolo, exactly like Canna Magnani. He was known basically only for comic gigs and a stand-up comedian, very popular, very well paid at the time. And that's a great intuition of Rossellini. He cast Magnani and Fabrizi that are known for their gigs as comedians and comic actors, and he gives them these incredibly dramatic roles, and they succeed magnificently.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why we call it avant spectacle is precisely because it was before the show. It was avanti before the show. So you would have these vaudeville acts, and then you would get the movie.
Yes?
Yeah, I was just curious about what kind of censorship apparatus existed in the fascists in the period.
There was a censorship system, but once fascism fell, all records were basically lost. I myself went to the Minkelpup, and I said to the guy, well, I went to the Central Archives in Rome, and I said, oh, where can I find the Minkelpup? And he's like, you have to get a time machine. So all the there were censorship codes and the notes, but I never met anybody who's ever seen them.
No.
They've all been
They
lost.
were brought to Venice when there was the puppet Republic of Salò that was controlled by the Nazis. So a lot of records went lost. And the Direzione Generale del Cinema was one of the archives that was transported up to Venice and somehow got lost. Censorship was very, very strong, very effective. What is important to understand is that it was preventive censorship. So filmmakers and especially producers were very, very careful not to do anything that would alert the government censorship. So it was a way basically of making sure that they would provide their own censorship, because the disaster would have been that after the film had been produced and money had been invested, you didn't get the approval. So it was very much done in-house in order to avoid this. Yes.
So you had to get your screenplay approved before you moved to production, and they could ask you to take out some stuff and put it back in. In terms of reconstructing it now, there's a scholar called Marie-France Curiol who's doing some really interesting stuff, and she's going to the Archivio di Stato, the National Archives, and she's looking at the records of the Secret Service during those years, because we still have those. And the Secret Service would send people outside the screenings to eavesdrop on conversations, the people who would leave the screening, and to see if they would catch sentences that would be contrary to what the regime wanted to think about the film. So if the film was subversive, you would understand that the film had been subversive by the reactions of the people. And I believe her research is still, undergoing. But when it's going to drop, it's going to be some of the most significant stuff that has been done on this type of film. And then we'll call her in and we'll make another movie, the sequel, before Neorealism 2.
Yes. And then the lady.
I learned a great deal from your film. I didn't realize that Mussolini had built Cinecittà, for example, and for all intents and purposes, you might say was the patron of it. But at the same time, in Germany, Joseph Goebbels takes over Babelsberg, Ufer Studios, and turns it into Ufer DIFA. So you have these two
Yes, it came later. I believe 1937. There was a film called Castles in Air, Castelli nell'aria, which was one of the first German-Italian collaborations.
There was a lot of, I'm sorry, can you hear me? There was a lot of exchange. I can't remember exactly the dates. Okay, so, but there were a number of films that were dubbed for each other's market. So, just a little anecdote. When I was researching for my dissertation, I found a film that I had never seen, an Italian film, in the archives at the MoMA. And I wrote the wonderful curator there, and I was like, "Can you please come see it?" And he's like, "Sure, come see it." So you book at this room, and you go there, and they screen it for you, which is wonderful. And when I got there, he looked at me in dismay, and he said, "I'm very sorry, but it's in German. It's it's the German version, and it was the MoMA had acquired a print that was a print for the German market." And I sat through anyways without understanding more than 2 or 3 words, but it was very interesting to see, Vittorio De Sica dubbed into German. So I'm not entirely sure on, to what degree, because I know in the early 1930s it was, it was very vibrant and was very fertile. Mike Neufeld was there, Walter Ruttman's there, but in the later period, I think it was more industrial. So it's like, you make films for me, I make films for you, or you're going to screen my movies, I'm going to screen your movies too.
I wanted to cover it. I just couldn't get enough feedback from the people with whom I spoke, and I couldn't find any really good footage either. So that was a subject that I kind of did want to cover a little bit in the documentary, but just because of the lack of resources and just kind of the vague kind of idea around it, I had to kind of omit it.
Yes, ma'am. And who is the author again? Soldati, yes. Yes.
Yeah, he made a couple of comedies. He made a few. He made one in '39. It's about, mistaken identities and love. And then he made a very interesting one called Tragic Night, Nota Tragica, in 1942. That is one of the films that we're discussing, a sort of like transitional film. It's immediately before Ossessione, and it has some of the qualities that Ossessione has, but it also ultimately, it's not quite there, you put it that way. But I mean, we talked about, these international collaborations with Germany, and Soldati was one of the screenplayers of Acciaio, that film that we showed very briefly. It was based on Pirandello, and then Soldati, Neufeld, and Emilio Cecchi wrote them. Like we said, it's like there's always a number of screenwriters for these things. But he did direct a few movies, yeah, quite good ones too.
Do we have other questions? What's next for this film, David? What do you envision doing with this film?
I would like to maintain an educational license on it and sell it to universities. That's kind of where I'd like to go with it. I think it would be kind of beneficial in world studies or world cinema studies. I made this out of the kind of frustration that whenever we talked about world cinema or Italian cinema, it would just start at 1945, and it would be this very vague. It was a vague. Oh, they came after this series of films that were supposed to be like really, escapist, and it wasn't true. And then Neorealism happened, and I was like, okay, well, what's going on? What about these films? And there was nothing. So I made a documentary about them.
Well, we have
in English, a lot in Italian.
We have a little reception for you upstairs, but I could not finish this evening without saying that we couldn't be more proud of our 2 alumni, David Lee Morea and Alberto Zambenedetti, for the great work they did with the documentary.
And we couldn't do it without you, obviously. Nothing would have happened.